In this video, Ayrton Senna is not just a Formula One champion, he is a hero. A man who faced human, technical, and moral limits in the final hours before everything changed. Here, we revisit the last weekend in Imola, the signs that few wanted to see, the silences laden with meaning, and the invisible decisions that shaped his destiny. We are not just talking about an accident, we are talking about courage, responsibility, and the price heroes pay for leading by example. By understanding what Ayrton felt and faced in his last hours, we understand why his absence still hurts, and why his legacy continues to guide generations on and off the track. If this video made you see Ayrton Senna in a different light, subscribe to the Behind the Legend channel. Here, we reveal what history didn't tell, because some stories don't end. They continue, in those who still listen. Envy our feedback, Paines Lateres, Historico Salvas.
There are moments in history when time seems to slow down. Hours pass, but something invisible is already in motion. On May 1st, 1994, Ayrton Senna didn't just get into a Formula One car to race another Grand Prix. He carried omens, silences, and decisions that nobody noticed. Few people know what Senna saw. Few people know what he felt. And almost nobody knows what happened in those final hours before everything changed forever. In this video, you're going to discover the ignored signs in those final hours, the conversations that were never recorded, the internal conflicts of a man at his peak and at his limit, and why that Sunday was not an ordinary accident. Watch until the end, because understanding these last hours changes everything you think about Ayrton Senna. The day dawned quietly in Imola. Nothing in the sky indicated that Formula One was about to lose its greatest legend. But inside the hotel, Ayrton Senna was no longer the confident man the world saw on cameras. He woke up early, earlier than usual. Close sources say that Senna spent long minutes in silence, looking out the window. There was no music, there were no jokes, just an invisible weight in the air. That morning, Ayrton didn't talk about victory. He didn't talk about the championship. He talked about responsibility. Since the beginning of that weekend, something was wrong. On Friday, a serious accident had shocked the paddock. Rubens Barrichello, a young Brazilian driver and Senna's countryman, had suffered a terrifying crash during practice. The car had lifted off the ground, flipped multiple times, and slammed into the barriers with devastating force. Senna watched the replays over and over, his face growing darker with each viewing. He immediately left the circuit and rushed to the hospital to check on Barrichello personally. When he arrived, doctors were still running tests. Senna waited in the hallway, pacing back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. When the doctors finally confirmed that Barrichello would survive, Senna closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. But the relief was temporary. The accident had shaken something deep inside him. That night, Senna couldn't sleep. He called his girlfriend Adriane Galisteu and spoke to her for over an hour. She later recalled that he sounded different, not scared, but contemplative, as if he was processing something he couldn't quite put into words. He told her he loved her. He told her to take care of herself. And then he said something she would never forget. "Sometimes I wonder if all of this is worth it." She asked him what he meant, but he changed the subject. He didn't want to worry her. On Saturday morning, Senna arrived at the circuit earlier than anyone else. The mechanics noticed he was quieter than usual. He walked through the garage slowly, inspecting every detail of the car, running his fingers along the bodywork, checking the tires, the suspension, the steering column. He asked questions, technical questions, about the setup, about the balance, about the aerodynamics. The engineers answered, but they could tell he wasn't satisfied. The Williams car was difficult to drive. It was fast, but unstable. The active suspension system that had made the car dominant the previous year had been banned, and the team was struggling to find the right setup with the new regulations. Senna knew the car wasn't ready. He knew it was unpredictable. But he also knew that if he didn't push, if he didn't fight, he would fall further behind in the championship. Michael Schumacher and Benetton were dominating. Senna had 0 points after the first 2 races. The pressure was immense, not just from the team, but from himself. He had built his entire career on being the best, on never settling, on finding speed where others couldn't. But this time, the car wasn't cooperating. Saturday afternoon during qualifying, disaster struck again. Roland Ratzenberger, an Austrian driver competing in only his second Formula One race, crashed heavily at the Villeneuve corner. The car hit the wall at over 190 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Ratzenberger's car disintegrated. Medical teams rushed to the scene, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The news spread through the paddock like a shockwave. Drivers stood in silence. Mechanics stopped working. Team principals huddled together, whispering. Ayrton Senna was in his motorhome when he heard. He immediately walked out onto the track, alone, and made his way to the site of the crash. Marshals were still cleaning up the debris. Senna stood there for several minutes, staring at the tire marks, the twisted metal, the broken pieces of carbon fiber scattered across the asphalt. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, absorbing the reality of what had happened. When he finally turned to leave, someone noticed tears streaming down his face. That evening, Senna was devastated. He sat with his closest friends and team members, barely speaking. When he did speak, his voice was low, heavy with emotion. He questioned whether Formula One had become too dangerous. He questioned whether the pursuit of speed had gone too far. He questioned whether he should even race the next day. One of his friends tried to console him, saying that racing was dangerous, that everyone knew the risks. Senna looked at him and said, "Knowing the risk doesn't make it acceptable." It was a profound statement, one that revealed how deeply he was grappling with the moral weight of what he was doing. Later that night, Senna did something that very few people know about. He called a meeting with several other drivers to discuss safety. He wanted to revive the Grand Prix Drivers Association, an organization that had been dormant for years. He believed that drivers needed to have a stronger voice, that they needed to be able to push back against the commercial pressures and demand safer conditions. But the meeting didn't go well. Some drivers were supportive, but others were skeptical. The system was too big, too powerful. One driver even suggested that if Senna was so concerned, maybe he shouldn't race. Senna was frustrated, but he didn't give up. He told them he would continue fighting, that something had to change. Before going to bed, Senna sat alone in his hotel room. He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. He wrote about life, about racing, about the fragility of existence. He wrote about his faith, about his belief that everything happened for a reason, even if that reason wasn't always clear. He wrote about his family, about his sister, about his nephews and nieces. And then he wrote about the race. He wrote that he would carry an Austrian flag with him, hidden in his cockpit, so that if he won, he could honor Roland Ratzenberger on the podium. It was a gesture of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of a life lost. Sunday morning arrived. The sky was overcast, grey clouds hanging low over the circuit. Senna woke up early again, around 6 o'clock. He didn't eat much for breakfast, just some fruit and juice. He dressed slowly, methodically, putting on his race suit, his boots, his gloves. He looked at himself in the mirror for a long moment, as if he was seeing someone he didn't quite recognize anymore. Then he picked up his helmet, the iconic yellow helmet with the green and blue stripes, and left the hotel. At the circuit, the atmosphere was somber. Everyone was still processing Ratzenberger's death. The race organizers held a moment of silence before the driver's briefing. Senna stood with his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him. When the briefing ended, he walked to the Williams garage. The mechanics greeted him, but he barely acknowledged them. He was focused, distant, locked into a mental space that nobody else could access. He climbed into the car. The seat was molded perfectly to his body. The steering wheel fit his hands like an extension of his own limbs. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Around him, the mechanics made final adjustments, tightening bolts, checking telemetry, communicating over the radio. But Senna was somewhere else. He was visualizing the race corner by corner, lap by lap. He was preparing himself mentally for what was about to come. Before the cars rolled out to the grid, Senna had a brief conversation with one of the team engineers. The engineer asked him how he was feeling. Senna paused, then said, "Today is a serious day." The engineer didn't know what to make of that. It wasn't the kind of thing a driver usually said before a race. But Senna didn't elaborate. He just nodded, put on his helmet, and waited for the signal to go. The cars formed up on the grid. Senna was on pole position, the result of his qualifying lap the day before. Next to him was Michael Schumacher in the Benetton. Behind them, the rest of the field spread out in rows. The grandstands were packed with fans, many of them wearing yellow, Brazil's national color, in support of Senna. Flags waved, cameras flashed, the roar of the engines built to a deafening crescendo. Senna looked up at the sky one last time. It was brief, almost imperceptible, just a glance upward. Then he lowered his head, focused on the lights above the starting line, and waited. The red lights illuminated one by one. 5 lights, 4 lights, 3 lights, 2 lights, 1 light, and then darkness. The race had begun. The start was chaotic. Cars jostled for position through the first few corners. Senna maintained the lead, but behind him there was contact. 2 cars collided, sending debris across the track. The safety car was deployed immediately, neutralizing the race. The field slowed down, bunching together behind the safety car. Senna was frustrated. The Williams needed heat in the tires to generate grip, and the slow pace was cooling them down. He could feel the car becoming more difficult to control with every lap. The safety car stayed out for 5 laps. During that time, Senna radioed his team, expressing concern about the handling. The car felt unstable. The rear end was loose, and the steering was heavier than it should have been. The team told him to stay calm, that everything would stabilize once the race resumed. But Senna wasn't convinced. He could feel something was wrong. Finally, on lap 6, the safety car pulled into the pits. The race was back on. Senna accelerated hard, pushing the car to the limit to rebuild tire temperature. Schumacher followed closely behind, looking for an opportunity to overtake. The 2 drivers raced wheel to wheel through the first sector, reaching speeds of over 190 miles per hour. It was intense, thrilling, the kind of racing that defined Formula One. But then, on lap 7, everything changed. As Senna approached Tamburello, a fast left-hand corner taken at full throttle, something went catastrophically wrong. The car didn't turn. It went straight. Senna tried to correct, yanking the steering wheel, but there was no response. The car shot off the track at nearly 200 miles per hour, crossed the grass, and slammed into the concrete barrier with devastating force. The impact was instant and brutal. The front of the car disintegrated on contact. The right front wheel was ripped off and shot backward, striking Senna's helmet. Debris flew in all directions. The car came to rest against the wall, mangled and broken. In the grandstands, fans stood frozen, hands over their mouths. In the paddock, monitors showed the crash in slow motion over and over again. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Time had stopped. The medical team arrived within seconds. They could see immediately that this was not an ordinary crash. Senna was unconscious, his head slumped to the side. Blood was visible on his visor. The doctors worked quickly, carefully removing him from the cockpit, stabilizing his neck, preparing him for transport. A helicopter was already waiting. Within minutes, Senna was airlifted to the hospital in Bologna. Back at the circuit, the race continued. Some drivers didn't even know what had happened. Others knew, but had to keep racing. It was a surreal, horrifying situation. In the Williams garage, engineers and mechanics stood in silence, staring at the monitors, hoping for news. Hours passed. Updates came slowly, each one more devastating than the last. And then, finally, the official announcement: Ayrton Senna had died. The news spread around the world within minutes. In Brazil, people poured into the streets, crying, hugging each other, unable to believe what they were hearing. In Europe, broadcasters interrupted regular programming to report the tragedy. In the Formula One paddock, drivers, team members and journalists struggled to process the loss. Ayrton Senna, the three-time world champion, the man who had redefined what it meant to be fast, the driver who had inspired millions, was gone. The final hours of Ayrton Senna were not just the end of a life. They were the mirror of everything he was. Discipline taken to the extreme, relentless pursuit of truth, and a rare awareness about risk, responsibility, and purpose. Senna didn't die from recklessness. He died knowing that something was wrong and still choosing to face it. These final hours reveal something that statistics never explain. Ayrton Senna didn't race just to win. He raced to feel meaning. After that day, Formula One changed. Safety became a priority. The FIA implemented new regulations, new crash tests, new barriers. Tracks were redesigned, cars were made safer, lives were saved. But the price was too high. What few realize is that Senna, even in silence, forced this change, not with public speeches, but with the symbolic weight of his absence. When we look back, we don't see just an accident. We see a system that needed to lose its greatest name to finally listen. The final hours of Ayrton Senna don't talk about death. They talk about consciousness, about the exact point where talent meets limit, where courage meets risk, where greatness meets humanity. And perhaps that's why decades later he's still present. Because some names don't belong to the past. They belong to what we still need to learn. Senna's legacy is not just in the races he won or the records he set. It's in the questions he forced us to ask. What is the cost of excellence? What are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of greatness? And when do we say enough? If this video made you see Ayrton Senna in a different way, then it fulfilled its purpose. Here we don't just tell famous stories. We reveal what remained hidden between the lines of history. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the silent moments, the invisible decisions, and the human costs behind the great icons. Leave your like. This helps the video reach more people who still feel Senna's absence. And comment, what struck you most about these final hours? Because some stories don't end. They continue in those who still listen.